Saturn is in Pisces 7 now. And when we're thinking about Saturn, we have to think about our social responsibilities. Saturn is about the social contract. And a lot of people, particularly younger people approaching their Saturn return with only a small amount of knowledge of astrology, they are trained by other astrologers to fear the Saturn return. And it's got that finger-wagging quality of imposed authority associated with it, which makes young people particularly anxious whether they can actually reach the standards required of them, do the duty, get on with life in the proper way, and come to terms with the difficulties that they're facing. This is the reputation of Saturn, and that's not at all unfair. It's just one-sided. Saturn has the functionality of bringing that which lacks form into clear definition. Without Saturn, we wouldn't have structure. We wouldn't have traffic lights. We couldn't drive cars. You wouldn't know whether to drive on the left side or the right side, and so on. Saturn is actually that which protects us from chaos. And this happens on all the levels. So on the one level that we're discussing now, the social level, there would be chaos if there were no laws and no justice system. And we can't live with that. That would take us out of civilization. And it's even, it's easy for us to consider that the rules imposed by society are unfair. And very often they are. And we're looking at this question here in Pisces 7, because the image is of crucifixion. It's a very powerful image, crucifixion. It was a torturous method of killing wrongdoers in the Roman period particularly, and of course is most associated with the death of Jesus. Now, crucifixion gives us the sense of a cross, which has 4 points to it. And the number 4 always gets an esotericist thinking about the material world. The earth, air, fire, water configuration, for example, the north, south, east, west configuration. Things that actually can be perceived only because of physicality. Now, physicality requires form. It requires structure. That's what it is. And if you take away the structuring force that gives rise to molecules and everything beyond, then there's chaos. There's an amorphous mass of undetermined energy, and we can't do anything with it. We don't know what it is. We can't influence it. It's not real, not really real, because we need structure to think of reality. Crucifixion is that structure on the esoteric level. And it hurts. Very often it hurts. It hurts if you go against the laws and practices of society. Morality is a practice of society, and it's far harsher than laws. There are quite a lot of things that we can do which are in keeping with the law of the land, but against common practice on the basis of morality. Certain relationship questions, certain money questions, certain questions of dress and speech, and all manner of other behaviors are determined by the finger-wagging of society rather than the law of the land to protect the community. And this is a different question when somebody has actually somehow, either individually or collectively, imposed structure when the recipient of that imposition is reluctant to receive it. So in other words, an unfair law which gives more money to the rich than to the poor. You get people reacting against that. And laws which have to be decided on the basis of faith or religion or that kind of thing, such as the abortion debate that's going on at the moment, whether or not the government should have the rights of a woman to determine that question. So certain Saturnine instructions are given and impositions are imposed and so on, which give rise to a rebellious attitude in the individual. This is what we're studying here. Excuse me. So, Pisces 7, a cross lying on the rocks. Sticking up for your own principles. At the extreme end of the spectrum of compromise or irritate, many of us may stand firm in our self-determined position of authenticity, and yet if we do, we will undergo some type of crucifixion. Society does not tolerate any extremely rebellious activity, so one is often attacked who refuses self-betrayal through excessive compromise. Nonetheless, this very process accelerates the rebel's personal evolution. Food for thought. Excuse me. If we didn't have unfair imposition of structure, then we could not develop the rebellious response to that. We need a problem to fight against problems. We need injustice to determine our attitude to injustice. So it's no good saying, I wish there was no Saturn, or I wish Saturn was imposed fairly. That will never happen. And actually you're missing the point, because it's our response to the unfairness that's the point here. Each of us has a rebellious streak. None of us is accepting of everything. It's just not true. Just to say that there are some people who are living entirely without the rebellious streak. Not in my life. And that rebellious streak can be occasionally felt, very rarely, by some people. And on the other hand, some people live in this constant frustration and anger and irritability against their perception of an unjust society. Society will contain rebels and must contain rebels. There's no question about that. But the question that we're discussing is, when do you rebel? At what point does the reasonableness of community imposition degrade itself into the power possessor's unfair tyranny? This will be different for different people at different times in different countries. It's not an absolute at all. And actually, when we come to terms with this, we're defining our personality very clearly. Some people can accept an unfair, unreasonable boss. I can't. I would never allow that in my life. And yet other people can, and they do allow that in their lives. Possibly because they have not the will to change it, possibly because they have a deeper sense of serenity and peace. And that's the question we're looking at here. On the one hand, acceptance, and on the other hand, the will to change. And this reminds us of the serenity prayer, doesn't it? Can we find a way to change what we can't accept? Or can we find a way to accept what we can't change? And do we have the wisdom to know the difference? So here we have the question of what is the wisdom to know the difference between these two choices we have of acceptance or forcing a situation to change. And that depends a lot on your spiritual station, your ability to accept on the one hand, and your magician's ability almost, your power of will to make things happen the way you want them to be. Even society, you can imagine that one person can change society sometimes. So very strong will, very clear focus, and we can get things done, or at least move ourselves away from the source of our problem. Now, if we look at if we look at Jones on this question, this is great. A cross lying on rocks. This is a symbol of withdrawal from reality in one aspect, as a means for re-grasping it in another. Here dramatized by a wholly unnecessary acceptance of the world's common repudiation or neglect of an individual's higher ideals. So what is being said here is that society repudiates and neglects the individual's higher ideals. It's not my business, your business, not my business. It's rejected by the community. And you can withdraw from that with that rejection and re-grasp your sense of self, where you can be real elsewhere. That's what he's saying. Implicit in the static symbolism is the need to be active in the cause of every standard or allegiance through which life has been made worthwhile, and the insistent stirring of an inner voice which seeks to quicken the soul to a paramount necessity of existence. So, the inner voice insists, this must change, I can't accept this, and so on and so forth. And Jones is just saying, then change. If that inner voice says change, then change. The key word is conscience. When positive, the degree is a rugged independence of inner spirit and a courageous rejection of all outer compromise. And when negative, utter timidity of self-interest. So Jones is focusing on the aspect of this configuration where we must change it because it just doesn't sit right within us, so we must change it. And I think when Saturn's going through this degree, we're going to be confronted with issues of that type, imposed requirements upon us that we just don't like. And Jones is saying, well, change them, change yourself, change your situation, get out of it, which is okay. And yet there's the inner possibility also. You can actually change yourself. Something has to change, granted, but it does not have to be the external situation. You can change your own attitude to what's going on. So if you've got a situation which you really can't change, you need the money that you get from your job, and the boss that's a little bit selfish and bullying sometimes is actually the best you can get. That scenario is quite commonplace. Then you have to change internally. In other words, you have to accept. Well, by changing internally, you're actually deepening your relationship with soul. And this was what I was thinking about earlier, that without this grit in life, we can't really grow. We develop our finest qualities only by coming up against injustice and obstacles of that nature. It's only because we have a hard time with society that we actually shape ourselves into rough diamonds sometimes, and we deepen the strength of authenticity. Everything else is actually secondary to that question in life. We have to find out who we are. And when we have found out who we are, this coincides with finding out where to be, where to locate ourselves in terms of our home, in terms of our job, in terms of our social group. There's a certain configuration of that type which allows us to be exactly who we are with no compromise. And we have to find that. It is suggested by the Sufi teacher Hazrat Inayat Khan that the absence of that in life is the cause of all conflict. It's because people are not in their right place that they struggle and they elbow each other out of the way to find their right place, to look for a place where their authentic self can be expressed very well. And the way to find that place is not by luckily being born into parents who give you that place. That's absurd, isn't it, really? The way to find that place is constantly, repeatedly to come up against something you don't like, you don't fit with. The bad boss, the inappropriate pressure from your social group, peer group pressure, and so on. You know, this is normal for most people. And that's what we want. We want Saturn. Saturn actually accelerates growth much more than some of the more gentle planets. You know, Venus, for example, you just do what you like. Normally, I know it stands for the principle of values, according to most astrologers. It does not, however, stand for the process of going through conflict in order to determine your values. It's just an expression of them. So how do you actually determine your values, what you prefer to other things? That's what that means. What do I like best? And that's an expression of self-identity, the authentic self. So we do need to determine values, but we don't determine that with the softer planets like Venus. We determine that with the harder planets like Saturn, Mars, Pluto. These planets actually accelerate our development more than the others. And the majority of people that you know will not be interested in that. But those of us that are on a path of self-development and personal evolution and a spiritual outcome to our lives, we actually do. We want to grow fast towards a more awakened state of being. Well, we won't do that without the grit that such planets as Saturn provides. Saturn in Pisces 7, then, is a crucifixion of sorts. It's making us come to terms with society, whether we like it or not, forcing us through a process of growth. Now, it's not only society. I've spoken about society because of Saturn. It relates to physicality generally as well. So your physical body may give you a hard time that you have to come to terms with, or your physical life, your garden, your health, or, you know, those kind of things. They're also related to Saturn. Basically, we have to come up against that which crucifies us, that which brings pain and suffering, and actually get to a point where that's not what we feel. We start off by feeling that feeling, but we get to a point of maturity and calmness and serenity and peace, which you normally associate only with older people, Saturn-type people. And this is because it takes a long time to learn that some things you can't fight against, other things you must fight against. And to develop the wisdom to know which of those two is appropriate in this particular, very personal situation, that takes experience and the assimilation of experience into knowledge through contemplation, study, guidance, and so on. So that's the life we've got, and Saturn will help us understand that much more clearly.